November 22nd, 1963. In Dallas, JFK is assassinated at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The world is shocked. To avoid an economic crash on the back of the news, North American stock exchanges began closing for the remainder of the day as soon as word reached their doors. The New York Stock Exchange was the first to close at 2:10 in the afternoon. In Canada, the Montreal Exchange followed suit and shut its doors 9 minutes after New York. Toronto followed 4 minutes after that. But in Vancouver, officials were waiting for the call to close the Vancouver Stock Exchange. That call was to be made by John McGraw, the de facto head of the exchange. He was known as the godfather of Howe Street, Vancouver's financial district. But McGraw didn't snap to make the call. As time passed, the predictable started to happen. Sellers panicked and started dumping whatever holdings of theirs they could find a buyer for. Share prices for VSE-listed companies started dropping across the board. Even strong companies like BC Telephone had lost half their value in minutes. Then, right according to plan, McGraw started buying huge numbers of shares in companies on the Vancouver Stock Exchange. McGraw knew that even the death of a president wasn't enough to keep the market down forever. He was buying the dip and betting on a speedy recovery for the most reliable companies at the exchange. Finally, after delaying as long as he could get away with, McGraw made the call to close the Vancouver Stock Exchange at 2:55 Eastern Standard Time, 32 minutes after Toronto and 45 minutes after New York. The day of JFK's assassination was a Friday. McGraw spent the rest of his weekend privately buying up as many shares as he could in companies that he knew were solid but were now selling at a heavy discount. Markets opened like normal on Tuesday, and before long, McGraw had netted more than $1 million for a single weekend of trading. What McGraw had done was not a crime, and he had broken no exchange rules with the move he had pulled. What he had done was leverage his position to create a situation where he could make a big gamble. Both McGraw and the investors who sold their shares were taking a risk with what they did. It just so happened that McGraw ended up on the winning end of those trades. But importantly, McGraw didn't have any insider information that gave him the upper hand. Both he and the other investors were all operating on the same information the day that Kennedy died. At least in theory, the playing field between the public and the stock exchange should have been even. But that would not hold true for very long. In a matter of years, the Vancouver Stock Exchange would become synonymous with scam, and Vancouver's international reputation would wind up in the gutter. Whether McGraw should have closed the exchange sooner that day is debatable, but there's a reason they called it the wildest exchange in the West. That was just how business was done at the Vancouver Stock Exchange. By the end of the 1960s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was widely known as the place to be if you wanted to make money. After the windfall scandal in Toronto and the ensuing clampdown by the Ontario Securities Commission, the junior market for mining in Ontario had fallen apart. This sent mining businesses scurrying west to Vancouver in what was essentially a modern-day gold rush. Teck Corporation, today the second largest mining company in Canada, relocated their headquarters from Toronto to Vancouver in 1972. When it came to mining, Bay Street was old news and Howe Street was where there were new fortunes to be made. And like moths to a flame, this attracted a horde of brokers and promoters to the Vancouver Stock Exchange from Toronto. As one book put it, after Windfall, Pyramid, and Dynasty, the VSE was deluged by promoters from Toronto, many of whom had never met a gentleman, much less knew how to act like one. This new migration brought with it some of the biggest characters the Vancouver Stock Exchange ever saw. One such character was Morris Black. Black was a foul-mouthed, superstitious, semi-literate man who also happened to be a wizard when it came to stock promotions. One associate of Black's once said that he was the toughest little shit that ever walked Bay Street, Howe Street, or any other street where there was money to be made. Black's story in finance started when he was a boy in Toronto selling newspapers on Bay Street. Infatuated by the stories he would hear about mining and prospecting, in the late 1920s he took off in the bush. By the 50s, he'd realized that better money and less bushwhacking came through stock promotions. His first infamous promotion was in 1957. When out to dinner in New York one night, he discovered his waiter's last name was Rothschild. Black cooked up the idea to form an investment company with this waiter named F.J. Rothschild & Company, and rent out office space in a building on Park Avenue directly across from the well-known address of the extremely wealthy Rothschild family. Under this company, they began to sell shares in Great Sweetgrass Oils, Black's company which was listed on the American Stock Exchange. At the height of their promotion, they were netting $1 million per week, up until the SEC delisted the stock. Not only did the SEC charge Black with defrauding the American public to the tune of $15 million, the RCMP in Canada pressed tax evasion charges on $8 million from the same scheme. Not only was Black's case with the RCMP the largest of its kind ever in Canada, it also became the longest income tax trial in Canadian history. At the end of the trial, the presiding judge concluded that there wasn't enough evidence of Black's intent to commit tax fraud, and he was acquitted of all charges. But that didn't mean people thought he wasn't guilty. Once the Ontario Securities Commission was made aware of his pending cases with the SEC and RCMP, they made it known that any company associated with Morris Black would be inspected with a fine-tooth comb. In effect, they were making it so no one in Toronto would dare go near him with their business. Just like that, his future on Bay Street was over. So, in the early 60s, Black packed his bags and headed to a place that the regulators didn't know about him: Vancouver. Black's business deals weren't always full of hot air, though. One of his first promotions after arriving in Vancouver was Endico Mines, a company that ended up finding a molybdenum deposit in BC, a scarce but critical ore for steel production. Just days after listing Endico on the VSE, the company was bought out with a massive payday for its shareholders. Even though Endico ended up with a successful mine and made Black a fortune, he couldn't for the life of him pronounce the word molybdenum, nor did he care. "I don't give a shit how you pronounce it, it makes money and sells." Black was well known for his particular blend of vulgarity and broken English. Attempts to correct his English were met with classic Blackisms like, "I don't care a fuck." In 1975, Black joined Viola McMillan in the exclusive club of Canadian promoters that were convicted of a crime and actually saw prison time. Black had been sentenced to 6 months of prison for 34 counts of wash trading a VSE-listed company. Wash trading, or buying and selling stock to and from yourself to give the appearance of market activity, was what Black used to refer to as Jewish budgeting. Yeah. A friend of Black's once said that Morris Black makes Murray Pezim look like a choir boy. And Murray Pezim was no choir boy. Another Toronto transplant like Morris Black, Pezim frequently referred to himself in the third person as the Pez. The Pez rode the highest highs and lowest lows of the stock market, losing and making several fortunes over his career. Some called him a Jewish Howard Hughes. Others called him manic depressive. Though he declared bankruptcy several times, he somehow always managed to bounce back and make a big splash while doing so. At 14 years old during the Depression, Pezim left school to work in his dad's butcher shop in Toronto. By the 50s, he was working at a brokerage house selling penny stocks on Bay Street. The Pez was a showboater through and through. It's part of what made him a good promoter, but it didn't always help him personally. One time, Pezim was trying to impress some female flight attendants sitting around a hotel pool. According to the Pez, he dove off the diving board into a completely empty pool, breaking several bones, putting himself into a coma for 4 days, and a body cast for 8 months. When asked about the event, the Pez said, "I impressed him. It was worth it." Like many other promoters in Toronto in 1964, the Pez got the sharp end of the stick after Windfall, and like many others, he eventually made his way to Vancouver. The Pez brought an atmosphere of extravagance to the VSE that was more flamboyant than Vancouver had ever seen before. In one of his first trips out west, Pezim rented the Lord Stanley Suite at the Hotel Vancouver for 3 months, which effectively became a 24/7 party for the length of his stay. Businessmen, bankers, even cabinet ministers came and went, partaking in the women, the booze, and whatever else was there. If there was something they wanted that wasn't there, all they had to do was ask the Pez, and the Pez made it happen. In the 70s, Pesm sponsored a boxing match in Vancouver between George Chuvalo and Muhammad Ali. On paper, the fight should have been a financial success, but was mismanaged into one of the biggest failures in boxing history and ended up losing Pesm more than $200,000. Pesm's great successes at the Vancouver Stock Exchange were in gold. The first was the Hemlo Valley gold find in Ontario, one of the biggest goldfield discoveries in North America. The second was at Eskay Creek in northern BC, which produced a mine that to date has extracted more than 3 million ounces of gold and 160 million ounces of silver. These two stock promotions made him a fortune, but Pesm was never too good at keeping what he'd made. Between buying the BC Lions football team only to lose them after filing bankruptcy 3 years later, 4 marriages, plus a common law relationship with a 29-year-old woman when he himself was 70 years old, Pesm always seemed to bite off more than he could chew. Speaking of promoters, let's take a minute to talk about the treatment of Western civilization's most persecuted, misunderstood group of people: wealthy, white-collar criminals. When it comes to prosecuting white-collar financial crimes in Canada, our system differs from our neighbors to the south. In the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission is the government agency responsible for regulating market exchanges and protecting investors from fraud. In Canada, the RCMP handles the investigation and prosecution of financial crimes at the federal level in general. But specifically for securities, Canada doesn't have a dedicated national regulator like the SEC. Instead, each province has its own Securities Commission. At the British Columbia Securities Commission, regulation of the Vancouver Stock Exchange was done through their Office of the Superintendent of Brokers. The windfall scandal at the Toronto Stock Exchange in 1964 led to a series of clampdowns by the Ontario Securities Commission. As part of that process, the OSC looked towards other jurisdictions that were doing a better job of regulating than they were. Somehow, they unironically looked towards Vancouver. There was a perception that the relationship between the OSC and the Toronto Stock Exchange was much more strained than that of the Superintendent of Brokers in BC with the Vancouver Stock Exchange. A business columnist for the Globe and Mail wrote that the BC securities laws are almost word for word like those of Ontario, but there is this difference: the exchange and the commission work in harmony in Vancouver. The reason for this perceived harmony in BC was that while the OSC's time was spent almost exclusively on regulating the Toronto Stock Exchange, the BC Superintendent of Brokers barely paid attention to what happened at the VSE. In addition to commodities and securities, at various points in its history, the Office of the SOB in British Columbia has been in charge of regulating everything from real estate to insurance to mortgages. In 1964, the SOB's office only had 2 investigators, and the office itself wasn't even located in Vancouver. It was in BC's capital of Victoria, which hadn't had a stock exchange since 1925. At one point in the early 70s, the SOB's office had 236 open case files, some that would take hundreds of work hours to close. Less than 5% of the SOB's work was allocated to the Vancouver Stock Exchange. It wasn't uncommon that days would pass where the SOB's office wouldn't look at anything related to the stock market. They had an impossible workload that allowed the Vancouver Stock Exchange's shadier activities to slip under the regulatory radar. Morris Black and Murray Pesm were just some of the colorful characters who'd arrived in Vancouver from Toronto by the late 60s. Promoters from Bay Street had been arriving in droves. By the 1970s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was looking less and less like its former self with every passing year. What was once a place where everyone knew everyone, new faces were showing up every week. The growing Eastern presence in Vancouver wouldn't have presented a problem if the VSE's administration had been well organized and prepared for this influx. But of course, they hadn't been. The VSE was run by a board of governors, exclusively elected by and mostly composed of members of the VSE. The board, led by the elected chairman, would appoint a president to oversee the day-to-day operations of the exchange. The decision-making power at the VSE came from the board and from the chairman. The more of your member peers you could convince to vote for you, the better your chances of being elected to the board or as chairman. John McGraw had been the exchange's strongman for decades and had steered the exchange through a prosperous era. But by 1966, McGraw was slipping into retirement without an obvious successor lined up. Between 1965 and 1970, 8 of the 11 new memberships at the VSE were held by individuals or brokerages who had recently moved in from Toronto. The lack of succession planning at the VSE, combined with the migration of Toronto brokers to Vancouver, instigated two major overhauls of the Board of Governors. These became known as the Two Palace coups. The first coup was carried out in 1971, when John McGraw's old supporters on the Board of Governors were voted out in favor of national and local brokers more aligned with the interests of the recent Toronto arrivals. They had a different vision for the Vancouver Stock Exchange, as part of a national stock exchange. This was not a new proposal. By this point, the idea for a national exchange in Canada had been around for decades. The appeal was straightforward for some. As the market currently existed, stock exchanges within Canada were competing with each other to attract companies. Consolidation of the exchanges would simplify regulation, cut operating costs, and streamline the investment process in Canadian stocks. Unspoken by supporters for a national stock exchange in Vancouver was the fact that the VSE would almost certainly become a subsidiary to the much larger, much more established Toronto Stock Exchange, and lose much of the autonomy they enjoyed as a venture capital exchange in the process. Mike Ryan was more than happy to steer the VSE towards the goal of one day becoming part of a national exchange, and was elected as chairman of the board in 1973. One of Ryan's favorite stories to tell was how in grade 11 he spent $131 to buy 3 shares of Bell Telephone, which he later flipped for a tidy profit. This anecdote clearly highlights why Ryan appealed to the new Torontonians in Vancouver. Although Mike Ryan was a Vancouver local and had made his career through the VSE, he, like the Toronto brokers, preferred blue-chip stocks and established markets compared to mining and junior resource stocks. When it came to dealing with the press, Ryan was as different as he could have been from John McGraw. Ryan said more to the press about the Vancouver Stock Exchange in a month than John McGraw would have in a year. Exchange squabbles that McGraw would have once dealt with internally were now becoming dirty laundry for the whole town to see. But the big problem for Ryan was his inability to keep the members of the VSE happy. During Ryan's tenure, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was largely unprofitable and lacked direction. In 1973, a report was published by the RCMP on commercial crime in British Columbia, which focused primarily on stock fraud. The report estimated that 20 to 30% of local junior stocks listed at the Vancouver Stock Exchange were being manipulated by promoters to defraud investors. The VSE's reputation took a hit. On top of their bad image, discontent was rampant at the VSE because of the general lack of profitability in the current market. Leadership at the VSE had grown unpopular under Mike Ryan, and his faction of brokers were ripe for an ousting. The stage was set for a second palace coup. All they needed was a leader. They found it in Peter Brown.
Peter Brown was there. You ever heard of Peter Brown? I'll bet you haven't.
Peter Brown is the man who's made the Vancouver Stock Exchange respectable.
As a young adult in the 1960s, no one would have put Brown in charge of driving their car, let alone run a stock exchange. Peter Brown, nicknamed the Rabbit, was born to a wealthy, well-connected West Coast family. After partying his way through university at UBC and flunking out at age 20, he spent the next 5 years in Montreal and Toronto, learning the world of corporate finance. By the late 60s, he was back in Vancouver and working at a brokerage firm named Hemsworth, Turton & Company. That Turton was Ted Turton, the broker behind the successful pyramid promotion at the Vancouver Stock Exchange. Turton had bought into the firm when the Pez was struggling to make margin on his latest stock promotion, and sold his share to Turton for a fraction of what he had bought it for just a few years prior. When Turton joined the firm, their internal administration was severely lacking, and when the market took a nosedive in 1970, they were teetering on collapse. Peter Brown was not much of a help on that front. In the office, he was often found in the middle of a game of backgammon, to the point where a senior member at the firm would confiscate any backgammon board they found and pawn them away at garage sales. But it was clear to people around him that Brown was an excellent salesman, and he had the potential for more. By 1972, Brown, together with Ted Turton, were in the midst of renovating and restructuring their failing brokerage, now renamed Canarim. But when it came time to apply for approval of these changes to the VSE, Brown found that Mike Ryan had denied them, simply because of his dislike for Brown's character. He turned me down for no other reason than he thought I was a bad guy. He had to change his position in the end, because the board didn't have the legal right to reject my application. But Mike did me a great favor. He made me ask myself, how could I have got myself into a position where I could allow a guy like that to interfere with my career in that way? I told myself that I must have an awful lack of credibility. Another standoff between Ryan and Brown took place 2 years later, when Brown was looking to purchase a fourth seat at the VSE for Canarym. The most recent seat had sold for $4,000, so when a new seat went up for sale, Brown started bidding at $3,000. Ryan had purchased an additional seat for himself a few years prior near the 1960s peak price of $65,000. He wasn't keen to let Brown buy one for less than a tenth of what he had paid. Ryan organized an emergency board meeting, resulting in a new rule. No member brokerages at the VSE could own more than 3 seats. By the mid-70s, Peter Brown had transformed his work ethic in what he referred to as going from wastrel to workaholic. Where once he gambled the day away in the back office, he was now putting in 13-hour days trying to restore Canarym's reputation. His skill for sales remained, but he'd smoothed out his rougher edges and found a new drive. When the time came, he was someone VSE members could rally behind. By 1976, a second palace coup was a near inevitability. Years of extremely poor returns at the VSE and poor control over rule breakers under Mike Ryan meant that members were demanding change from the Board of Governors. Brown managed to get himself and 3 allies elected to the VSE board. Although he was only a junior member, Brown was personable and quickly secured influence over other board members. Even as a rookie to the board, he was almost immediately able to start making changes to how the exchange had been run under Mike Ryan. The first step was abandoning the idea of trying to imitate Toronto's way of doing things. But as Brown saw it, the main thing holding the VSE back was that there were too many regulations. People say the VSE is unregulated. The fact is, I think it's got to the point where it's overregulated. If you've got 2% breaking the rules, new rules won't stop them. Whether it was 2% or closer to 20% like the RCMP claimed, Brown was right. It didn't matter how many new rules were created if none of them were ever enforced. What the VSE needed was to appoint a president who would actually go after the most egregious abusers and throw the proverbial rulebook at them. The board found their guy in Bob Scott, former head of the Alberta Securities Commission. When it came to enforcement, Bob Scott was probably the most effective president the Vancouver Stock Exchange ever had. By the time he left the position, he was known as the sheriff of the wildest exchange in the West. Scott had a keen understanding of how a stock exchange worked, and as a result, he took a radically different approach to how he governed the VSE. Rather than piling on rule after rule in response to last week's fraudulent stock promotion, he went on the offensive any time he suspected a promotion to be rotten. Prior to Scott's term as president, trading on scam stocks was typically only halted after the price collapsed and the promotion had run its full course. Instead, Scott would frequently stop suspicious bull runs while they were on the way up, giving the exchange time to investigate the underlying company. If the company was clean, history had shown that trading momentum was relatively unaffected after a stock resumed trading. If it wasn't, well, then the jig was up for that promoter. While it didn't make him popular with the promoters, Scott's personal integrity and hands-on methodology were extremely effective at bringing back one of the things the VSE most needed: credibility. No one benefited from this period at the Vancouver Stock Exchange like Peter Brown did. Like John McGraw before him, Peter Brown didn't outright own the exchange, but it felt like he did. As a junior board member with considerable influence by his mid-30s, Peter Brown understood how the VSE worked better than anyone around. One of his key insights was that although the main source of revenue at the VSE had been on the trading floor since the exchange was born, the future was in underwriting. An underwriting is the process of listing a company on the stock exchange and releasing those shares for sale. The brokerage who performs an underwriting gets paid for that service in shares of that company at extremely low prices before the company has even started trading. The potential returns on the underwriting of a good company are massive. Peter Brown wasn't the first to realize this upside. People like John McGraw knew that before Brown had ever set foot at the VSE. What had changed was technology. With the advent of computers, in 2 decades, the role of floor trader would be completely eliminated at most exchanges around the world. This meant that no matter what, emphasis on the trading floor would diminish over time. With underwriting front of mind, Brown turned Canarym into a money-making machine. Canarym became the dominant brokerage at the VSE, underwriting nearly 3/4 of all newly issued stock in Vancouver by the early 80s. This put Canarym's estimated value at around $250 million. Around the same time, the Rabbit was also made chairman of the board at the Vancouver Stock Exchange. By 1987, Brown had amassed a personal net worth of more than $55 million. Among his personal properties were a mansion-sized cottage on the exclusive Bowen Island near Vancouver, as well as a Shaughnessy mansion where he kept a $200,000 imported Rolls-Royce convertible, as well as a custom closet filled with 70 pairs of Gucci loafers. According to Brown, his feet had high arches, and they were the only shoes he found comfortable. With newfound profitability at the Vancouver Stock Exchange in the late 70s, competition between firms in Vancouver was more fierce than ever. One VSE firm caught one of their brokers stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from both clients and the company. Instead of reporting him to the police, the firm made the man repay the money, then helped him to get a job at a rival firm, hoping he would do the exact same thing to them. No matter how many honest actors there were on Howe Street, ethics were always a weak point for the exchange. The attitude was always that if you could get away with something, you might as well do it. Crooked brokers and promoters were more than happy to treat the VSE like their own personal ATM, and it was costing the public their fortunes. In 1979, a report found that, on average, people putting money in stocks at the VSE were losing a portion of their money 84% of the time, and losing all of it an astounding 40% of the time. That same report also found that barely half of all investment dollars on the VSE made their way to the companies on the exchange. Nearly half of that money was being paid to brokers, promoters, and other VSE insiders who serviced the exchange. The VSE, like any other stock exchange, never had the intention of being a charitable institution. Winners would rise to the top, losers would sink to the bottom, and the exchange would take their cut for their role in running the show. The intent for the VSE, at least what they said publicly, was that any money, either domestic or international, that made its way to the exchange would help fund resource development ventures in and around British Columbia. The whole point was that the general public would benefit from the exchange through the investments it produced. But catalyzed by the events of the 1960s, the VSE was devolving into a machine that extracted profit solely for those working the exchange. Separating investors from their dollars became the primary objective, and the merit of the underlying companies they were financing became secondary. As the 70s came to a close, Bob Scott struggled to keep the VSE in line in a meaningful capacity. In the years following the Second Palace coup, the exchange had ballooned in size and activity. On top of local individual investors, the exchange was attracting big investments from international mutual funds and pension funds from across the US, Europe, and the Pacific Rim. In a 5-year span, the VSE went from 65 employees to 225, not to mention the influx of new promoters and brokers. There were too many new faces, too many stocks to monitor, and just not enough resources to cover it all. In 1976, the annual value of stocks traded at the VSE was $328 million. By 1981, it was $3.86 billion. By then, the workload was just too much for Bob Scott, who was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Scott had been the most effective regulator the VSE ever had, but in the end, he had to step down, leaving enormous shoes to fill for whoever came after him. Changes were coming for the Vancouver Stock Exchange. That same year, the Howe Street Carnival moved slightly off of Howe Street and onto the corner of Granville and Dunsmuir, into the brand new Stock Exchange Tower. And what better time for this big move than 1981, the year of the largest stock market crash since 1929. Generally speaking, if the stock market crashes, publicly listed companies suffer, sometimes to the point of bankruptcy or failure. But in Vancouver, that didn't necessarily mean the end of the road. According to Peter Brown, the VSE was the perfect place for a company to fail.
One of the advantages to Vancouver is that we have a set of rules in place that if a company fails in its venture, it is easy to reorganize and for that failed venture to acquire new assets and get a second life for the shareholders.
What Brown was referring to is the fact that at the Vancouver Stock Exchange, listed companies could change their entire business at the drop of a hat. A company that specialized in mining one week could rearrange and market themselves as computer experts the next, and there were no rules against this. From the mouth of the Rabbit himself, this was a feature of the Vancouver Stock Exchange, not a bug. It was meant to be able to give companies a chance to dust themselves off and try again if they were struggling. But the ability for companies to completely pivot in their core business would come to play a prominent role in fraud at the VSE in the 1980s. This leads us to another big problem. For the majority of their history as an exchange, resource extraction companies made up the bulk of their listings. Mining, lumber, oil companies, and so on. But as the 80s rolled around, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was seeing increased diversity in the kinds of venture companies listing there. Tech, software, real estate, medical devices, furniture, you name it. Because mining companies were so common for so long, brokers, promoters, and regulators alike generally knew what to look for to tell if a mining company was running some sort of scam. But it was much harder to understand whether a company that specialized in mining, then underwater basket weaving, then real estate was legitimate, or if they were blowing hot air and trying to defraud investors. With Bob Scott gone, the exchange was under-equipped to deal with the run-of-the-mill scams they were used to seeing, but they were completely unprepared for the barrage of scandals that were coming for them that decade. The first major scandal of the 1980s harkened back to the gold rushes, with New Cinch Uranium. New Cinch was a VSE-listed mining company who had found surprising mineralization at one of their properties in New Mexico. Test results showed that it was home to an unexpected abundance of silver and gold. The reaction on the VSE was delirious. New Cinch's stock price climbed from $2.50 to $29.50 over just a few months, as speculators fawned about the company's prospects. Problem was, the test results had been faked. There never was gold or silver at the New Mexico property. Once it was disclosed that the test results had been falsified, the stock collapsed to pennies. But not before the VSE promoters for New Cinch cashed their shares out at the top, leaving a flock of lambs holding the bag. No criminal charges for anyone at the VSE or New Cinch were ever laid in connection to this promotion. What the New Cinch scandal did do was bring into question what sort of accountability should be expected from the VSE when it came to certifying the information companies listed on their exchange were conveying to the public. When Bob Scott had been president at the VSE in the 70s, they'd made significant progress in vetting the validity of press releases made by listed companies. But it wasn't the 70s anymore, and Bob Scott was gone. After New Cinch, press releases from VSE-listed companies were required to include a footnote that the information contained herein has neither been approved nor disapproved by the Vancouver Stock Exchange, effectively absolving the exchange of any and all responsibility. Chop Computer Corporation was one of the most famous scandals out of the VSE. The Columbia Homogeneous Parallel Processor was supposedly the next big deal in supercomputers, and was marketed as operating up to 100 times faster than their competitor. Between November of 1984 and the following 14 months, shares in Chop rose from 17 cents per share to more than $120 per share. Not only was this the first VSE stock to break the $100 mark, at its peak, Chop accounted for nearly 7% of the entire Vancouver Stock Exchange's market value. For reference, at its peak, Nortel, another major Canadian stock scandal, was worth 38% of the value of the Toronto Stock Exchange, before their fall from grace and into oblivion. But the difference between Nortel and Chop was that Nortel actually was a tech company. As it turned out, Chop Computer Corporation was nothing more than a shell company. The Chop supercomputer was being developed by their sister company Sullivan Computer Corp in California. Chop Computer Corp's main asset, on which their entire valuation was based, was the right to distribute that computer when it went into production. Chop Computer Corp had actually only just changed their name earlier that year from Baz Resources, a company that just months prior had been specializing in mining. But the real kicker with Chop was this. There was no supercomputer being built by either Chop or Sullivan Computer Corp. Like most swindles on the VSE, investors were being fed a string of salacious lies to drive the company's stock price up higher and higher for as long as possible so that the promoters involved in the scheme could offload their shares at inflated prices before the stock crashed. Everything was on the table if it meant the stock price would climb higher on the news. Midway through their stock's bull run, Chop made an announcement that Michael Jackson's brother Randy was planning to buy $2 million worth of Chop shares. As the stock price rose, Chop was also fueling interest with a potential merger with Sullivan, even as the unveiling date for the supercomputer, their only product, was repeatedly delayed. From an objective perspective, the scam was flawlessly executed. By the end of 1986, CHOP stock had crashed and the company had delisted itself from the VSE as they prepared for a merger with Sullivan Computer Corp in the United States, away from the jurisdiction of the Superintendent of Brokers and the RCMP. The unfortunate message that many promoters took away from CHOP was that lucrative promotions at the Vancouver Stock Exchange could be carried out even without a product to speak for. No supercomputer from CHOP ever materialized, and no one at the Vancouver Stock Exchange was ever charged for their involvement in CHOP. Genuine success stories at the Vancouver Stock Exchange were harder to find in the 80s, but there were a few. In 1984, geologist Chuck Fipke listed his company Diamet Minerals on the VSE. Fipke was on the hunt for diamonds in Western Canada, a place where they had never been found before. Fipke had developed a new method for identifying indicators for the conditions necessary for diamond growth. After years of rigorous sampling and exploration in northern Canada, in 1991, Diamet finally found what they were looking for in the Northwest Territories. They had discovered the first diamond deposit in North America. Not only did this discovery make Fipke incredibly wealthy, it sparked a fever of excitement on the VSE when it came to diamond mines in northern Canada. And with that excitement came a wave of new scams set up to capitalize on the public's fear of missing out. In 1993, there were more than 200 Canadian companies that were chasing the diamond hype in Canada, staking nearly 30 million acres in the Northwest Territories in the hope of duplicating Fipke's success. But the vast majority of that land was what people in the Canadian mining industry refer to as moose pasture, land that's as good as worthless. Most of these clout-chasing companies were not diamond experts like Fipke. Some couldn't be farther from it. You had companies like Slumber Magic Adjustable Bed Company and Reimer Overhead Doors, who were buying up random parcels of land in northern Canada in the hopes of boosting the share prices of their completely unrelated companies. Even the legitimate success stories from the Vancouver Stock Exchange couldn't escape the parasitic culture that had been allowed to fester and grow in Vancouver. The list of scams coming out of Howe Street just goes on and on and on. VTech Diagnostics was a company looking to raise capital through the VSE. They alleged to have made $3 million selling diagnostic AIDS tests. In fact, not only had they actually lost almost $1 million, but the company's president, who claimed to have a doctorate from Yale, was actually a chiropractor from California. Shares in Tilex Enterprises on the VSE rose from 20 cents to $77 over the course of 2 years on the back of falsified financial statements. The company peaked at a market value of $172 million before being delisted for fraudulent activity. VSE regulators only realized the mining company turned insurance company wasn't legit because in their financial statements, they had failed to put aside any funds to actually pay out insurance claims. These are just a few of the most egregious swindles from the late 80s. But the full list of scandals at the Vancouver Stock Exchange from that time period is staggering. The promise of the exchange had always been to further investment in Western Canada. The exchange was no longer doing good by their promise. More than a few people lost some or all of their savings or pensions that had been invested through the exchange. And sure, you can call that out as part of the risk-reward of playing the stock market. The thing is, the public was led to believe that at the Vancouver Stock Exchange, there was an even playing field for investment risk. But you, as an individual investor and outsider from the Howe Street Carnival, always had the odds stacked against you. By the late 80s, the exchange was treating the public exclusively as lambs for slaughter, and it wore away at whatever small amount of legitimacy the exchange was holding on to. Contributing to all of this was the fact that yet another power vacuum was forming at the VSE. The two most influential leaders for the exchange at this time were Peter Brown and Gus MacPhail. By 1989, Brown had his hands full working on a merger between Canarim and another major Canadian brokerage, so he was in the process of winding down his involvement in VSE management activities. On the other hand, Gus MacPhail had been John McGraw's protege since the 50s and had been heading his brokerage Continental Securities since McGraw's retirement. MacPhail was also Peter Brown's biggest rival at the VSE and would have been a shoo-in to lead the VSE after Brown's departure, had he not died from cancer in 1989 at the age of 55. This meant that there was no clear leader at the Vancouver Stock Exchange with the kind of influence required to deal with what was about to be the biggest blow ever to their reputation in the court of public opinion. Industry insiders like to call the Vancouver Stock Exchange North America's premier venture capital exchange. To the public, it knew other names, like the Howe Street Carnival, Las Vegas North, or the wildest exchange in the West. But the exchange's definitive nickname came in 1989. Forbes magazine published a scathing expose about the gong show that was the Vancouver Stock Exchange. Years of scams on Howe Street had not gone unnoticed, and karma had finally caught up to them in a devastating blow to their international reputation. The title of the Forbes article read, "Scam Capital of the World." Both the title and the article as a whole were an attack on the very character of the VSE. In less than 5 pages, the article tore at the exchange from every angle. Like most large North American cities, Vancouver has a serious garbage disposal problem, but this one is unique. The garbage is the Vancouver Stock Exchange. It is polluting much of the civilized world. Generally speaking, the most respected fiction writers in Canada are Margaret Atwood and Robertson Davies, but no one churns out a body of fiction as consistently high quality as the companies listed on the VSE. The knee-jerk reaction from the exchange was to point the finger anywhere but themselves. Exchange President Don Hudson blamed the exchange's poor image on superficial assessments from unobjective observers. No one in charge of the VSE was willing to take a hard look in the mirror and see themselves for what they had become. Plagued by years of scandals and a lack of external or internal regulatory enforcement, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was reaping the image it had sowed. It felt like rock bottom. But that's the thing about rock bottom. You never really know you're there until you're out of it. The Vancouver Stock Exchange wasn't done digging. By the mid-'80s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was proud to say that they were the leading exchange in Canada when it came to volume of shares traded. But the value of an individual share is meaningless. You could divide up the same company into 1 million shares or 1 billion shares, but it's the value of all the shares of that company combined that tells you how much it's really worth. When you looked at the actual value of shares traded, it was no contest. After the crash of '87, not only did Vancouver fall to second in terms of share volume, but the Toronto Stock Exchange was by far the clear top dog in Canada, with a solid 75% of actual trade value. Vancouver had less than 4% of the Canadian stock market's value. Making matters more embarrassing for Vancouver was the source of a lot of the new capital coming onto Howe Street. A non-negligible amount of money that made its way onto the VSE was through less than legitimate sources. BC has long been a gateway for significant amounts of illegal trade and money coming into Canada. In the 80s and 90s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange played a key part in that supply chain. It was an open secret that the VSE was a place where organized crime could easily launder their money. For example, VSE member firm First Vancouver Securities was suspended, then later removed from the VSE when it was discovered they had ties to the deposed Filipino dictator Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos was notorious for his government's corruption, and it was suspected that millions of dollars he had stolen from the Philippines had been given to First Vancouver Securities and laundered through the Vancouver Stock Exchange. By the 80s, even the gangs in Vancouver were getting involved in the stock market. The biggest was the Hells Angels biker gang, who had been expanding across Canada since the late 70s. While most of their divisions across the country were making their money in the drug trade, the Vancouver branch was #1 when it came to wealth, thanks to their business ties to Howe Street and the VSE. With more gang involvement in the 90s also came an uptick in the number of suspicious deaths of Howe Street associates. In 1990, VSE broker and known friend of the Hells Angels Ray Janetti was shot and killed in his home in West Vancouver. In 1994, former VSE director Nick Massey and his wife Lisa disappeared and were never seen again. In 1997, VSE promoter David Ward was shot while sitting in his car. Again in 1997, Ernie Ozelins and his girlfriend were found dead in their home. Ozelins had ties to the Hells Angels and had only a few months prior been involved in a pump and dump scheme at the Vancouver Stock Exchange. Way back in 1982, Michael Opp was shot in the head in his apartment in Phoenix, Arizona. Opp was a former employee of the company who had falsified the gold and silver discoveries in New Mexico in the New Cinch scandal. Ops parents believed their son was killed because of the information he provided during the lawsuits that took place in Canada against New Cinch. The Vancouver Stock Exchange was becoming a dangerous place to be associated with. Which brings us back to the issue of prosecution on Howe Street. Throughout the 80s and 90s, the BC Securities Commission dealt out a handful of charges and minor convictions. But their massive workload meant it was nearly impossible for them to police the Vancouver Stock Exchange in any meaningful capacity. In 1981, a report comparing BC and Ontario found that the Office of the Superintendent of Brokers in BC had a workload 4 times larger than the Ontario Securities Commission. The OSC had 31 employees for that workload. The Superintendent of Brokers had 9, and 3 of those positions were unfilled. Vacant positions at the SOB's office were at least partially related to salary. Being a securities investigator required smarts, dedication, and years of experience in the industry. Yet in the late 80s, the top of the pay range for investigators at the SOB's office was an uncompetitive $32,000 per year. Underfunding the Office of the Superintendent of Brokers was a conscious choice by the BC government. Not only were political parties in BC dependent on support from the business community in Vancouver, in some cases, the politicians themselves were inextricably tied up in the exchange. Politicians like John Reynolds and Bill Bennett. Not only was John Reynolds a federal and provincial politician for British Columbia, he was also a successful Howe Street promoter. Shortly after his appointment as Speaker of the BC Legislature in 1986, John Reynolds stepped down as President and Director of VSE-listed International Flyer Resources, which had recently converted from a mineral exploration company to an aircraft manufacturer. Shortly after Reynolds stepped down, the RCMP began an investigation into a price manipulation of Flyer Resources stock, which had seen a precipitous rise and fall over a matter of days in late 1986. Among the firms investigated by the RCMP was Carnival, where Reynolds' son Paul worked as a floor trader for the firm. Paul would eventually go on to succeed Peter Brown as CEO of Carnival. No charges were made over the course of this investigation, but the involvement of Reynolds' family ties did turn a few heads. Speaking of family ties, in the late 80s, John Reynolds' wife Yvonne was a manager at the very differently named Glider Resources, another VSE-listed company. Glider Resources couldn't for the life of them commit to an industry. They spent the late 80s jumping from one core business specialization to another. First, mining, then, you will never guess what's next, bat sanctuaries, then finally into real estate. This is normal. No, really, this is totally fine and cool and normal. At least, that was the case in Vancouver. But the biggest politician to be associated with Howe Street was Social Credit Premier of BC, Bill Bennett. Many of Bennett's major donors during his time in office were affiliates of the Vancouver Stock Exchange. But Bennett ultimately ended up getting too close to the action. In 1996, Bill Bennett was found guilty of insider trading by the BC Securities Commission. 8 years earlier, Bennett and his brother had sold off 500,000 shares in Doman Industries, 20 minutes before the news broke that the company who was planning to buy them out was canceling the deal, which inevitably tanked Doman Industries stock. That's not to say that the exchange was regulated any better after the SoCreds were replaced by the provincial NDP in the early 90s. 2 years into their term, the NDP appointed former head of the BC Business Council, Jim Matkin, to study the VSE, how it was being regulated, and produce a report with recommendations as to what the province should do. One of the top recommendations from Matkin's report was that the disciplinary process for member firms and their brokers, which was self-administered by the exchange, be handled instead by provincial regulators. But when NDP Finance Minister Elizabeth Cull announced the government's plans for reform in 1994, they chose to ignore Matkin's major recommendations and continued to allow the VSE to self-regulate trading violations, rather than arming the BC Securities Commission with that ability. Between the province's embarrassing lack of regulation on Howe Street and scandals every other week at the VSE, Vancouver newspapers had their pick of the litter when it came to filling up the business section. But the types of criminals and organizations tied to the VSE meant that journalism on Howe Street came with risks, professional and personal. The task fell to a dedicated few that truly thought the public had a right to understand just how rotten the VSE had become. People like David Baines. As a business reporter specializing in securities fraud for the Vancouver Sun, Baines made a name for himself as a thorn in the side of the Vancouver Stock Exchange over the course of his 25-year reporting career. In several instances, exposés written by Baines directly led to prosecutions and regulatory reforms in British Columbia. Unsurprisingly, Baines was not well liked on Howe Street. Baines was known around Vancouver as the most hated man in business. In 1992, Vancouver police were made aware that someone had taken out a murder contract on Baines's life. Reporting on the VSE in the 80s and 90s was not for the faint of heart. Adrian du Plessis was another investigative reporter working to expose the seedy underbelly of Howe Street. Du Plessis was more qualified for that job than most. He had spent 6 years as a floor trader at the Vancouver Stock Exchange in the 80s before getting fed up with its rampant culture of corruption. In 1988, he wrote a book called Sideshow, The Howe Street Carnival, which blew the whistle on everything he'd seen and uncovered about illegal activities at the VSE. Du Plessis' vendetta against the Vancouver Stock Exchange was described in the 1989 Forbes article as a journalistic jihad. For his perpetual crusading, du Plessis more than once received death threats from strangers who would show up at his house. Much like Baines, the crooks at the VSE disliked the attention and scrutiny du Plessis brought to the exchange. It earned him a number of nicknames, like the Scourge of Howe Street, and my personal favorite, the Salman Rushdie of the financial community. Fraudsters and scammers at the VSE disliked du Plessis and Baines because they weren't motivated by profit like they were, and therefore couldn't be bought off. In a sea of smooth-talking hucksters, they were reporting on the facts and advocating for the people and communities who were on the losing end of the VSE's rigged games.
Well, like most of these VSE stories, it's sort of black humor. They're very funny if no one was getting hurt and if they were just pretend and monopoly money, but the fact is they all have a somewhat devastating effect, whether it be economically or environmentally.
Out of a pool of 187 applicants, du Plessis was hired by the BC Securities Commission in 1993 due to his extensive knowledge about the Vancouver Stock Exchange. For him, this was an incredible opportunity to work within the government to help take down crooks and bring some serious changes to how the VSE was allowed to operate in the province. But shortly after starting this new position, he got hit with a reality check when it came to how things worked, or should I say, didn't work, in BC's government.
While I was still working for the government and working inside the Securities Commission, I wrote to Elizabeth Cowles, she was my ultimate boss as finance minister, telling her that there were a lot of things going wrong and I'd be happy to tell her about them. She didn't contact me, so I realized you can't change the bureaucracy or the government from within because all they do is gag you or silence you, and as we've seen recently too, those who speak up get fired or put to the back of the bus.
To du Plessis, the government's inaction on tightening up enforcement at the VSE was unacceptable. The longer the exchange allowed a culture of fraud and corruption to perpetuate, the longer it would maintain its reputation as scam capital of the world, and the more the province stood to lose.
How do you think this is going to affect international investment in BC?
Well, it's just one example of money that won't come here because of the failure of this jurisdiction, of this government, the NDP, no different than the Socreds before it, or the Liberals to come, or the NDP to come. It doesn't seem to matter if they're right or left. They all fail to protect the public in areas of the stock market. But here's $13.5 billion that had been open, and money would have come to Canada, would have come to British Columbia to create jobs in all sorts of areas. Instead, because they were robbed and ripped off and lied to, not 1 cent of that money is going to come here. So where a lot of people don't realize that the VSE is more than just sort of a gambling den in the back corner, you know, that people can say, oh, we have nothing to do with it. This is real money that could have come to help build work, build, you know, things in British Columbia, in this province. Instead, it's going to go to other countries.
It became clear to du Plessis that the provincial government was either incapable or unwilling to take serious action when it came to cleaning up the Vancouver Stock Exchange. Just 4 months into his position with the BC Securities Commission, du Plessis quit and returned to work that he felt actually made a difference: investigative journalism that exposed fraud at the VSE. By the late 90s, the Vancouver Stock Exchange had been rightfully dragged through the mud by people like Baines and du Plessis. The exchange's image as a serious place of business was in shambles. The VSE had become synonymous with fraud, and as a result, they were bleeding investors, both locally and internationally. As it turned out, they weren't the only ones with that problem in Western Canada. The Alberta Stock Exchange in Calgary had also been plagued by its own scandals and had reached a new low in the late 90s with Bre-X. Bre-X Minerals, a mining subsidiary first listed through the Alberta Stock Exchange, had faked the discovery of a massive gold deposit in Indonesia in what is considered to be the largest mining scandal of all time. In the aftermath of Bre-X, the junior mining market in Canada fell into a freefall. What had been a rough decade for the VSE had only gotten worse, and they needed to figure out a way to save themselves from collapse. To do that would require the end of the Vancouver Stock Exchange as they knew it. Scheming minds at the Vancouver and Alberta Stock Exchanges realized they could help each other out by undergoing a merger. The new exchange would help cut down on operating costs, but more importantly, with a little help from the public's poor short-term memory, it would allow them both to wipe the slate clean and start fresh under a new name. In 1999, the Vancouver and Alberta Stock Exchanges merged to create the Canadian Venture Exchange. This merger turned out about as well as lipstick on a pig. Not even a Western alliance between BC and Alberta could repair the damage they'd inflicted on their reputations. When Toronto offloaded their junior mining market in the 1960s, there were mixed feelings about it as they watched it migrate west to Vancouver. The loss of business was a hit to their revenue, but it helped recover something even more valuable for the exchange: investor confidence. The subsequent 3 decades validated that decision for Toronto. Regulations were better enforced by the Ontario Securities Commission than they were in British Columbia. BC got to have their Carnival, but when the party was over, they had lost their credibility. To have any chance at getting it back, they were going to have to let someone who could play by the rules show them how it was done. In 2001, the Canadian Venture Exchange was bought out by TSX Group, the holding company for the Toronto Stock Exchange. Bay Street wasted no time putting their name on the door and renamed the exchange TSX Venture. The consolidation of the Western junior venture markets was the start of a growing movement. For decades, Canadian stock markets had been competing with each other to attract investment. Companies could list at multiple exchanges, but as with most financial matters in Canada, Toronto's gravitational field was usually successful in reeling in the big fish. In the late 90s, the stock exchanges of Canada came to an agreement to individually specialize but act as a united front. Montreal would handle the derivatives market in Canada. The TSX Venture Exchange in the West would focus on what they had always done best: handling the high-risk, high-reward junior market. If a company was successful there, they would be given a seat at the big boys table, the senior equity market housed at the Toronto Stock Exchange. Like a minor league farm team, the Venture Exchange was a training ground, sifting out the losers and finding the stars that could be sent east to the major leagues in Toronto. When the Vancouver Stock Exchange folded into the Canadian Venture Exchange, their home at the Stock Exchange Tower in downtown Vancouver relinquished their name, since that anchor tenant no longer existed. The new biggest tenant, who still have their name on the building at 609 Granville, was Peter Brown's investment brokerage Canarin, since renamed Canaccord Genuity. Peter Brown's business success hadn't slowed down since stepping away from the VSE, and he successfully brought Canaccord Genuity public with an initial public offering in 2004. They did so at the Toronto Stock Exchange. In 2008, TSX Group completed the infinity gauntlet of Canadian stock exchanges when they purchased the Montreal Exchange for $1.31 billion. In a nod to the old money capital of Canada, the holding company's name was changed from TSX to TMX, but the new name was mostly symbolic. The nationalization of Canada's stock market was complete, and Toronto had solidified itself as the definitive financial capital of Canada. Like John McGraw before them, TMX Group has kept an extremely tight lid on news about the inner workings of the TSXV. As a result, they've been largely successful in shaking off the scam-riddled image of their venture exchange. But 25 years later, Vancouver has still held on to its reputation as an easy place for organized crime to launder their money. The Vancouver model is an internationally recognized method for laundering money through casinos. A report estimated that in 2018, $7.4 billion was laundered through BC, and that money laundered in BC contributes to a 5% increase to the cost of real estate in the province annually, since the majority of money laundered in the province is used in the purchase of real estate in British Columbia. The fact that Vancouver is consistently one of the least affordable housing markets in the world is a direct result of the massive amounts of money laundered through BC. This is all to say that Vancouver has suffered, not only as a result of money laundering in the province, but from the environment of exploitation that the Vancouver Stock Exchange helped to normalize within British Columbia. The exchange was supposed to foster investment within BC, but over the course of its existence, it morphed into an entirely different entity. Call it a venture capital exchange, call it a casino, call it a carnival, you can call it whatever you want. But for everything it was promised to be and everything it wasn't, the Vancouver Stock Exchange was a tragedy for British Columbia. Hey there, looking for ways to support Canadian content? If so, go and check out my Patreon. As part of my Patreon, you'll get early access to all video releases, an invitation to my Discord server, access to behind-the-scenes content, and more. Your support would be greatly appreciated, so go ahead and check it out if that sounds like it would interest you. Thanks!